A clash between a beautiful VA nurse and a dangerous biker gang took place in a quiet Veterans Memorial Cemetery just outside of Houston. What happened next would become a legendary event that affected the lives of countless people. Grace Anderson's kind smile and caring blue eyes belied the heart and skill of a fighter, something the motorcyclists failed to realize when they chose to intimidate her. Unexpectedly, their blunder would set in motion a remarkable story of salvation, demonstrating that the most perilous individuals are sometimes the ones you least anticipate. Please tell us in the comments where you are listening to us before we begin today's story. Also, subscribe if you like reading this kind of content. Tomorrow, we have another incredible story in store for you. As Grace Anderson walked into the cemetery in the morning sun, golden streaks were painted across the perfectly white rows of tombstones. Her halo of light-catching blonde hair framed her face as she bent down to lay new flowers on a veteran's tomb. Her motions were elegant and controlled, exuding the unassuming self-assurance of someone who has witnessed the world's harshness and its splendor. While delicately caressing her father's gravestone, Grace remarked, "Another beautiful morning, Dad. Your favorite flower, the rose, is in full bloom." With the first rays of morning illuminating the VA hospital emblem, she fixed her immaculate scrubs. Reminders of her own service were subtly shown on her collar, a little combat medic pin and an American flag. As 5 motorbikes smashed past the cemetery gates, their chrome exhausts piercing the holy quiet, the fragment of the morning was shattered. After 2 tours in Afghanistan, Grace's instincts were on high alert, and she rose cautiously to her feet. The Iron Hand MC insignia conveyed a message of brutality rather than honor, and the leather cuts identified the bikers as members. "An angel playing in the dirt, that's what we found, lads," called out their commander, Thorne, who had a snake tattoo visible above his collar. Grace kept her speech calm, but her blue eyes became more intense. "All honor is due here, gentlemen. Respect is something I'll have to beg of you." Boots crunching on gravel, the riders drew nearer. The club's enforcer, Chad, trampled the flowers she had delicately set down. "Oh no," he scowled. "It seems the lovely nurse has some manners and lessons to teach us. What am I seeing here?" Thorne got off his horse and stood tall above Grace. She felt her flesh crawl as his gaze darted over her. "I see an ideal location, one that is remote, peaceful, and ideal for some of our pursuits." Grace showed no fear. She had learned more than simply life-saving techniques throughout her time as a battlefield medical trainee. "Can you tell me what I'm seeing?" She maintained an almost clinically professional tone in her speech. "Men who have no concept of what this location stands for are all around me." Chad reached out and accidentally grabbed her arm. For years to come, the veteran community would gossip about what happened next. Grace brought him to the ground while he was in a textbook hold, a series of fluid motions mastered during his time in Special Forces medical school. She added calmly, "As a nurse, I took an oath to do no harm." She maintained the hold with evident ease. "I learned firsthand as a military medic just how much force is required to dislocate every single joint in a human body. How about we show you something?" A sudden screech of incoming motorbikes stopped the remaining riders in their tracks. Under the command of Sergeant Major Williams, the Veterans Guard MC marched in, their insignias and decorations prominently displayed on their patches. Not exactly weekend warriors, were these. Those men had proven themselves worthy of the privilege of riding. "Good morning, Grace," Williams yelled with the measured confidence of a veteran soldier. "Are these lads up to no good?" Chad had ceased to struggle, but Grace kept her grip on him. "Nothing is too big for me to manage, Major." "I can see that," Williams said while chuckling before becoming grave. "You two chose the wrong graveyard to start problems in, and you certainly chose the wrong woman to threaten." The dismounting of the Veterans Guard troops was accompanied by the methodical precision that characterizes their military training. Numerous combat patches bearing the insignia of having served in elite units such as the Special Forces, the Marines, and others. Thorne's confidence wavered as he tallied up the newcomers. Listen, we would prefer to avoid any conflict. Grace finally exclaimed, "You should have considered that before you disrespected these graves." She then released Chad, who scampered away while rubbing his shoulder. Here, each gravestone symbolizes a life sacrificed so that you, the writer, could pretend to be tough. My dad is one of those people. Williams advanced, exuding an air of authority. It will unfold like this. You guys are about to find out why this area is important. This Grace is no ordinary nurse. You can't put a number on how many lives she saved. Just like her, half of the men buried here were nurses from the Veterans Affairs system. And if we decline, Thorne asked, his voice betraying his former assurance. When Grace looked directly into Thorne's eyes, he finally saw the steely determination that lay beneath her amiable exterior. Then I will be more firm the next time I touch your friend's shoulder. Despite what the members of the Iron Hand had anticipated, non-violence ensued. The morning turned out to be one of metamorphosis, nevertheless. Grace started telling the stories behind the headstones that the motorcyclists had desecrated while the Veterans Guard looked on. Grace related the story of the young soldier's sacrifice, and Thorne found himself kneeling at his grave, listening. He was 19, she whispered. Despite leaving behind a mother who continues to bring flowers every Sunday, he threw himself on a grenade to rescue his squad. Following the nurse's proper treatment of Chad's injured shoulder, he assisted in repairing the floral arrangements he had earlier damaged. Among the fragile petals, his hands, which were often so ready to strike, exhibited an unusual delicacy. Grace walked amid the graves as the morning sun rose, her tales gradually wearing away the biker's hard facade. Fathers who never saw their children, brothers who died fighting side by side, and moms who lost their lives for their nation were all things she recounted. Little did I know. While adjusting a miniature American flag, Thorne's voice became scratchy with emotion. Never got a clue from these stones. Every stone tells a story, Grace responded, her voice resonating through the now mellowed cemetery. All stories are worthy of respect. For that reason, I come here first thing in the morning to make sure they aren't overlooked. Grace had no idea that this confrontation would trigger a series of events that would change the community as a whole, not just the Iron Hand MC. The stunning VA nurse who had defended sacred land with unwavering resolve would go on to inspire others and bring about change, demonstrating that understanding, not violence, is often the most effective weapon. Retribution, honor, and surprising allegiances are only the beginning of this incredible story. A tale that shows how the most unexpected connections can change people's lives and how appearances may be deceiving. Grace Anderson's obvious authority earned respect even from these tough men, as Sergeant Major Williams observed as the dawn shadows lengthened across the graveyard. As she bent down next to yet another tomb, her blonde locks reflected the sun's rays. Members of the extermination squad surrounded her like reproachful students. Standing on the polished stone, Grace informed me that this one was a medic, just like me. To ensure that 3 Marines could return home to their families, Thomas Walker went through intense fire. He died doing it. Her blue eyes were fierce as she raised them to Thorne's face. Serving is our purpose. This area is important because of that. The writer's metamorphosis was plain to see. Chad continued to stroke his shoulder, but now he seemed ashamed instead of aggressive. In place of their customary swagger, the others stood silently, their uneasy awareness of their surroundings and actions replacing it. Thorne began, "Miss Anderson," his voice now rougher than previously. "Yeah, we had no idea." "Now you do," Williams interjected. "I want to know, what are your plans to address this?" A pickup truck drove into the cemetery before Thorne had a chance to respond. Maria Alvarez, who works at the neighborhood cafe, sprung out with trays of coffee and tacos for breakfast. Tommy Hensley's mechanic's truck rumbled into the driveway behind her, its rear loaded with tools. "Did you hear about the problem?" With her gaze fixed on the spectacle, Maria yelled out. "Accompanied by breakfast and reinforcements?" Grace grinned as she saw the community coming together around their holy place. "Time is of the essence, Maria. We were about to get some assistance with some maintenance from these gentlemen." The cemetery was changed in the following hours. Members of the Iron Hand were able to work with soldiers and locals under Grace's guidance. While riding, Tommy and Thorne destroyed a fence, which Chad and Thorne helped him fix. As one veteran after another came to pay their respects, the others tended to the graves, straightened the flags, and listened to the memories of the departed. "Were you on the payroll?" While Grace was taking a water break, Thorne noticed that, despite her kind exterior, she moved with military precision and asked her about it. Her response, as she wiped perspiration from her forehead, was 2 tours in Afghanistan. She hesitated, her gaze averted, as a combat medic witnessed things. "Putting on an exterior of toughness is something I get, more than you may imagine." Instead of, Thorne made a hand gesture toward himself, becoming a doctor, he became a nurse. Grace's expression was troubled, yet resolute. "By rescuing people, I intend to pay tribute to their sacrifice. This is my way of honoring the memory of every veteran I assist at the VA and every burial I manage here." Franklin Sarge, Mitchell's arrival struck up a chat. There was an instant air of reverence for the elderly Vietnam veteran, cane in hand and all. Observing the biker's reserved expression, he took stock of the situation. Well, Sarge remarked, his voice belying his seniority by decades. "You guys seem to have been taken care of by our guardian angel." Williams responded, "She did more than that," as she observed Chad tenderly replanting flowers near a grave. With her help, they grasped it. More and more veterans showed up as the morning progressed, attracted by rumors of the confrontation. Everyone had a story to tell, and everyone's story added to the change that was happening. Members of the Iron Hand discovered themselves encircled by actual history, by individuals whose subtle power rendered their own efforts at intimidation appear ineffective. An older woman informed Thorne, "My husband is here," as she laid flowers on a grave. Until he joined his friends last year, he came here weekly from Korea, although he never mentioned it much. As he assisted her in arranging the flowers, Thorne's touch was remarkably delicate. The earnestness of his comments surprised him as he assured her that they will maintain the grave's appearance. From a distance, Grace observed these exchanges, her heart filled with unexpected hope. She had witnessed change in the past, when injured soldiers returned home or when broken souls recovered, but this was unique. It was a moving experience to witness people's hearts soften when confronted with indisputable facts. "You did good, kid," Williams chimed in, then joined her. "You should be proud of your dad." The behavior of touching her combat medic pin, which Grace had established while thinking about her father, became habitual for Grace. A chance to learn better, he maintained throughout his life. While we're on the subject of education, Williams pointed to the motorcyclists. "It is high time we demonstrated to them the true meaning of brotherhood, in my opinion." The members of the Veterans Guard started telling their personal stories as the sun rose higher. These were tales of devotion, sacrifice, and the genuine meaning of brotherhood. Instead of fidgeting, the members of Iron Hand listened intently. According to Williams, "We too bike, but our riding is more deliberate. Assist the families of the slain warriors, accompany them home, and preserve their memories." Grace noticed how Thorne and his staff were affected by these remarks. Like a light gently coming up, it showed them a way they hadn't realized existed. Something had altered behind their eyes, albeit the hard exterior was still there. Perhaps, Thorne mused as he watched his workers. Perhaps we've been executing this incorrectly from the start. Changing directions is always an option, Grace said with a soft but determined tone. Do you have the courage to give it a go? Additional motorbikes arrived and cut short the occasion. The morning's activities had been reported by members of many veteran riding clubs. Dwayne "Tank" Harris was one of them. He wore his Desert Storm service medal with pride on his vest. Tank, his commanding voice echoing across the fields, yelled out because he had heard certain people needed a lesson in respect. Grace, though, Seems to have taken care of it already. Members of the Iron Hand clenched their jaws, but Grace took the lead. She stated emphatically that they are learning. All we can ask for at times is that. By the time lunchtime rolled around, the cemetery had transformed from a mere battlefield into something more. A place of change, it was transforming into a classroom. Members of the Iron Hand, who had come as invaders, were gradually being consumed by something greater than themselves. As they conversed, Grace observed everything, attending to graves in between. Her presence served as a continual reminder of their purpose in being there. She had stunned them with her strength and beauty, but that was not all she was. To them, she was becoming an intermediary between their current reality and a better one. Gathered around the center flagpole, Tank led everyone to the graveyard as the midday sun pounded down. A large shadow was cast by his enormous bulk over the assembled veterans, motorcyclists, and citizens. With her dirty nursing scrubs from the morning's work, Grace stood slightly aside, yet her presence still commanded respect. Tank started speaking with the authority that comes from years of experience on the battlefield. I was prepared for battle the moment I received the call regarding the disturbance at the cemetery. This kind nurse, on the other hand, has taught me more than any drill sergeant I've ever had. As the audience giggled, Grace could feel the unease in Thorne and his staff. What had happened earlier had taken their confidence and left them vulnerable and unsure of themselves. Thorne raised his voice to address Miss Anderson, his voice displaying an unusual hint of modesty. Regarding the importance of respect and purpose, we have been reflecting on what you stated. Grace waited with her arms folded. In the VA hospital, she had witnessed this same moment before, the one when an apparently inflexible front eventually gave way, exposing the potential for inner transformation. It is our intention to rectify the situation, Thorne said. Not only today, but perhaps we might find out more about your job duties as well. William advanced, giving Grace a knowing glance as he did so. How ironic that you should bring it up. Protesters' possible presence at tomorrow's veterans' funeral has relatives on edge. At a funeral, protesters, Chad's voice quivered with shock. The idea made Grace's blue eyes sharpen as she added that it happens more often than you would expect. According to some factions, it conveys a message. Typically, the Veterans Guard is on hand to maintain order and decorum. As soon as he offered to provide a hand, Thorne seemed ashamed of his own zeal. Okay, if you'll only let us. Tank's thunderous laughter relieved the strain. Permit you? You have an obligation to assist every individual laying here after what you did this morning. The village librarian, Claire Dawson, showed up with a load of books, cutting off the talk. After placing them on a bench nearby, she remarked that she thought these could be useful. Unit histories are shown here. Accounts of those who have been awarded the Medal of Honor. As Grace ran her fingertips over the book's embossed cover, she took it up. Respect includes education, she whispered gently. You can't show respect for something you don't comprehend. With sincere curiosity, the members of Iron Hand clustered around the volumes. Grace observed the motorcyclists' curious leaning in as Claire started to explain the meaning of various military decorations and insignia. Speaking softly as she handed Grace a mug of freshly brewed coffee, Maria compared them to children. Children who were never shown the ropes by an adult. As Grace thought about her father, she nodded. Everyone needs an opportunity to prove themselves more capable than they give themselves credit for. An ad hoc lesson in history was added to the afternoon's agenda. Veterans-related anecdotes that drew parallels between the events described in the book and their own lives. As they listened, the members of Iron Hand asked more in-depth inquiries and seemed to gain a better grasp of the situation. With a gesture toward a page, Thorne introduced us to this Medal of Honor recipient. He rescued everyone in his unit. With his cane in hand, Sarge verified, at the price of his own life. That is the essence of genuine bravery. Neither being terrifying nor tough are important. It all comes down to your willingness to sacrifice for other people. With her own lessons in bravery fresh in her mind, Grace observed the exchange. "I discovered that the loudest voice isn't always the strongest," was something she said while in Afghanistan. Knowing when to extend mercy can be a source of true strength at times. The bikers remembered how she had restrained Chad and prevented any major harm, and they gazed at her with fresh eyes. The very idea she was outlining was on display there. Williams called everyone's attention to tomorrow's funeral. Military veteran who saw service in Vietnam. Some people like to protest military funerals, so families are bracing themselves for unpleasantness. We must demonstrate to them the true meaning of respect. Grace observed that the members of Iron Hand straightened their bodies, automatically imitating the stances of the veterans surrounding them, while he detailed the security plan. "It felt as if I were a witness to the molding of a piece of raw stone into something useful." With a box of miniature American flags in tow, Tommy informed us that these would be necessary. We arranged them along the entranceway. The family should know that they are not alone. The motorcyclists treated the flags with an unusual degree of respect, as if they had just come to terms with the significance of the symbols they represented. Grace gracefully displayed them in the correct manner, showing off her impeccable technique. Chad walked over to Miss Anderson while still somewhat leaning on his shoulder. "Until this morning, I've never witnessed such a display of movement from anyone. How did you get this knowledge?" Something bittersweet was in Grace's smile. Special Forces combat medical training. Knowing how to protect oneself and your patients is essential when treating wounded while under fire. However, he made an oblique gesture at her physical attributes. "Love. Ely, yes." A note of caution was in Grace's voice. "You can benefit from appearing innocuous, Chad." As pretending to be tough could conceal a deeper issue. I could feel her words ringing true. The guys who had attempted to frighten her were starting to get it. There were various ways to be strong, and their rugged exteriors might have been masking something more sinister. Preparations for the funeral the following day continued throughout the afternoon. As part of their training, members of the Iron Hand would assist the Veterans Guard in mastering security detail and motorbike escort procedures. Not only did it present a chance for atonement, but it also offered the potential to contribute to something truly significant. Right before we set out, Grace reminded everyone that tomorrow isn't about us, it's about a family bidding farewell to their hero. That is respected in all that we do. Grace felt a renewed sense of optimism as she watched the motorcyclists undergo a remarkable metamorphosis, their typical haughtiness supplanted with a focused resolve. The tiniest epiphanies can sometimes spark the most profound transformations. The following morning, Grace arrived at the cemetery just as dawn was painting the sky with shades of purple and gold. With her blonde hair carefully tied back, she exchanged her scrubs for a dignified black dress. As she took stock of the area, the dawn light illuminated the combat medic pin on her lapel. Members of Iron Hand were shockingly prompt, having already arrived. As a mark of respect, as Williams had recommended, they had polished their motorcycles till the chrome shone, and they all donned black armbands. Standing uncomfortably atop his leather vest was Thorne, who appeared more genuine than the day prior, despite the fact that he was wearing a borrowed suit jacket. Grace greeted the gentleman with a good morning shout, her voice resonating through the early sunrise silence. "All set to go today?" After saying, "Yes, ma'am," Thorne cleared his throat. "Last night, we read a little bit about the experiences of Vietnam War soldiers upon their return to civilian life." Grace understood the significance of the silence and nodded in agreement. "Then you understand the significance of today." The Veterans Guard was signaled by the low rumble of motorbikes drawing near. With extra American flags in their hands, Williams spearheaded the procession. Other veteran groups, such as the American Legion Riders and the Nam Knights, followed behind them, providing assistance in their own unique ways. Williams rounded everyone up, "So pay attention. Today, we have a straightforward yet vital task. Anyone attempting to desecrate our service will face a wall of respect from our family. It is your responsibility to work with the funeral home, Grace. Tank will show you escort positions while you're with Iron Hand. While everyone else went about their tasks, Grace could see that Chad was hanging about. He seemed concerned. "Is there something bothering you?" she inquired. "My old man," Chad whispered. "Last night I read those novels about him and how he drank himself to death when I was 15 years old. He served in Vietnam but never spoke about it. Perhaps now I have a better grasp of who he is." Grace felt the agony beneath his tough veneer as she delicately caressed his arm. "Also, you have the opportunity to honor him today." It took 2 hours for the first group of demonstrators to show up, and they brought with them vicious intentions and vile banners. A line of leather-clad veterans and motorcyclists stood shoulder to shoulder as they faced them. Standing tall with fresh purpose, the members of the Iron Hand were positioned between Tank and Williams. Grace quietly went from one mourner to another, bringing water and words of consolation. She noticed Thorne and his crew peering at the seasoned riders all morning, taking note of how they studied their polite demeanor and learned the meaning of power. The motorcyclists all simultaneously started their engines as the hearse pulled up. At this point, the low growl no longer threatened. Any attempt at dissent was drowned away by the thunder of appreciation. With their motorcycles creating a barrier to shield the sad family, Grace observed as Thorne guided his squad in their first official escort. In its solemnity, the burial service was lovely. Members of Iron Hand stood at attention with the others, their customary agitation supplanted by unwavering determination. Grace noticed that Chad blinked rapidly as the rifle salute echoed around the graveyard, perhaps prompted by thoughts of his father. They were contacted by the widow after the service. She exuded an air of poise despite her diminutive stature and advanced years. In appreciation, she remarked as she beheld the strange conglomeration of former criminals and war heroes. It was perfect for John. Motorbikes, he claimed, made him think of Huey's. Thorne removed his sunglasses with an unusually careful motion, and Grace gazed in awe. "Excuse me," he muttered, his voice rugged with emotion. "Being present for your husband was a privilege." Grace, Williams, and Thorne were standing by the just-dug grave when the crowds thinned out and the bikers rode away. The demonstrators had already departed hours earlier, vanquished by the formidable barrier of solidarity they had faced. Williams complimented Thorne on his performance today. "You all did. I experienced a sense of..." Looking for words, Thorne scowled. "Unlike anything we've done previously, it seemed natural." Seeing the transformation take shape brought a grin to Grace's face. To have a sense of purpose is to experience that. Thorne shifted his attention to Miss Anderson, his customary bluster gone. "We were chatting, the lads and I. In order to help, we want to know more about how to do this properly." Before answering, Williams glanced at Grace. Learning the correct protocols requires dedication, training, and time. According to Thorne, we are prepared. We can't return to our previous state in light of what we've learned and witnessed today. The change that Grace had seen occurred in her mind. Having threatened the tranquility of the cemetery, these men had now begun to protect it, marking a significant turning point in their journey. Be advised, it will not be simple. Sincere transformation is never possible. Nothing worthwhile ever is, Thorne said her, his comments revealing a surprising depth of insight. "But ma'am, we want to be a part of it after seeing what real respect looks like and after knowing the significance of this site." Right before the sun went down, Grace stood at her father's grave and filled him in on what had happened over the previous 2 days. There had been a change in the distant sound of motorbikes. It was an unexpected sound that brought promise, protection, and purpose. While delicately caressing the icy marble, she murmured, "You were right, Dad. On sometimes, the most seemingly unruly individuals are actually the ones who might use some direction, and on other occasions, the kindest people may guide those with the most determination." Grace continued to think about the changes she had seen a week following the funeral as she began her morning shift at the VA hospital. The familiar antiseptic scent and quiet hustle of early hospital routine were brought in by the automatic doors sliding open. There are guests in the lobby who have been waiting since the break of dawn, as Grace and Claire from reception pointed out. As Grace rounded the bend, she came to a sudden halt. With boxes of coffee and donuts in hand, Chad and Thorne stood uncomfortably in their leather vests. 3 additional members of Iron Hand shuffled anxiously behind them, appearing out of place in the early hospital crowd. A throat clearing was performed by Thorne. "If it's okay with you, we were hoping to express our interest in volunteering." It seems like Grace was taken aback by Chad's rapid response. After checking the VA website, he mentioned that there is a program specifically for hospital volunteers. "I take it you mean this seriously?" As Grace studied their features, she inquired. "We thought this was another opportunity to put things right after what we discovered at the graveyard," Thorne whispered. Just as Grace was about to reply, the voices of Franklin, Sarge, and Mitchell echoed down the corridor. "It seems like someone has finally found their heart's purpose." With his cane thumping against the polished floor, the old veteran walked toward them. He had become something of an unofficial greeter for new veterans seeking care at the VA after being a patient there for years. "Make a choice," Grace urged. "Come on. We can meet in the break room to discuss this." As they took their seats at the table, Grace couldn't help but note the striking resemblance between these men and the menacing figures that had stormed into her graveyard a few days before. The burden of comprehension had changed and was now resting on their shoulders. She started by saying, in a professional yet friendly tone, that volunteering here isn't easy. Veterans coping with visible and unseen scars, families grieving loss, and difficult-to-process things are all part of what you may expect to witness. It requires a level of strength that differs from your usual demeanor. According to Thorne, we are determined to gain knowledge. Your ability to be authentic while still showing strength in times of crisis is something we'd like to learn more about after observing you at the cemetery. Grace grinned as she recalled her own transition from military medic to VA nurse. "So, let's get down to brass tacks. The volunteer orientation is the first requirement. That's really comprehensive. Addresses all aspects, including patient confidentiality and appropriate methods of engagement." Grace spent the next hour explaining the details of volunteering. As they listened, members of the Iron Hand took notes and asked pointed questions. From their initial meeting, everything was completely different. In their final moments together, Chad mentioned something more. "Along with the Veterans Guard, we have been discussing the possibility of launching a program to provide veterans without access to a vehicle with transportation to medical visits." Sarges and Grace locked gazes across the table. An apparent sign of approval crossed the face of the elderly veteran as he gave a small nod. Grace emphasized the gravity of the situation. A lot of veterans don't show up for their appointments because they can't get to them. A planning session developed during the morning. Grace listened in while the once disruptive individuals discussed logistics, schedules, and safety procedures in great detail. They were now channeling their aggression toward a positive goal. One of the younger motorcyclists, Miss Anderson, raised her voice. "May I ask you something? Are you available to teach us the fundamentals of medicine? Not the complex fighting techniques," he hastily emphasized, "but simply how to assist a fellow traveler in distress." Grace gave the request some thought. 1 month from now, you can get your first aid certification. In any case, frequent volunteers are necessary to do it. Perhaps I might lend you a hand getting ready for it. More and more medical personnel wandered into the break area throughout the morning, captivated by the leather-clad guests. Grace was pleased to see that the members of Iron Hand kept their newfound respect for one another even when they were given suspicious looks. Visitation was briefed by Dr. Thompson, chief of the VA's psychiatric department. After he heard their plans, he drew Grace aside. In a low voice, he mentioned that veterans who experience social isolation are among our most challenging situations. By enlisting the aid of former motorcyclists, it may be possible to reach individuals who believe they are unhelpable. Unfamiliar from their initial encounter, Grace observed Thorne's act of goodwill as he assisted Sarge with his coffee. She responded by saying that sometimes people who have been through pain themselves are the finest healers. A younger veteran was observing them from the waiting area as Grace escorted the party out later. He had the tight expression she'd seen on so many others before, the face of someone struggling within while feigning strength. Thorne was also alerted. He came to a halt and cautiously walked up to the young man. His voice was kinder than Grace had ever heard it before, and he inquired if it was her first time here. He gave a rigid nod. "Yes, it is difficult," Thorne went on to say. "Nevertheless, guess what? It took me far too long to figure out that being humble enough to ask for assistance is actually rather powerful." While watching the brief exchange, Grace felt tears well up in her eyes. She had chosen to become a nurse for this same reason, to aid in the restoration of souls as well as bodies. Standing with Sarge, Grace watched as the motorcycles revved up in the parking lot and then rode off. Sarge admitted with some reflection that he had initially taken their presence in the cemetery for granted, dismissing them as nothing more than a group of miscreants feigning toughness. Grace touched her father's combat medic pin and replied, "But watching them now, sometimes the toughest exterior hides the most potential for change." Members of Iron Hand noticed a tremendous shift after only 1 month of participating in their volunteer program. From her perch at the main desk of the VA hospital, Grace observed as Thorne assisted a senior veteran off his bike with an apparent ease that had been non-existent a few weeks earlier. While revising the arrival record, Claire noted that this was the 3rd transfer of the day. They had been absolutely punctual for all of their scheduled appointments. While joining them, Dr. Thompson remarked, "I never thought I'd say this." He was holding a cup of coffee. "One of our most dependable volunteer groups, nevertheless, is quickly becoming theirs." Recalling the initial day of their first aid training brought a grin to Grace's face. Seated anxiously at their desks, the formerly menacing motorcyclists had taken meticulous notes and asked perceptive questions. After threateningly grabbing her arm, Chad now meticulously rehearsed bandaging techniques. A voice shouted out to Miss Anderson. As Grace spun around, she noticed Mike, the younger member of Iron Hand, rushing over to meet her. "An issue has arisen in the parking lot. Veteran of the Vietnam War is struggling. This appears to be a flashback." After Grace retrieved her first aid box, she and Mike headed outdoors. An old soldier, his face crushed against a wall, his eyes scared and far away, was kneeling beside Thorne when they arrived. "The choppers," the man murmured. "They're making a swift entry." Thorne was doing an excellent job of managing the issue, which surprised Grace. He maintained his distance, talked in a clear and calm manner, and had already removed anything that could cause additional anxiety from the area. According to Thorne, who spoke softly, "You are currently at the Houston VA hospital. In the year 2024, it is. Don't worry." With her professional instincts taking control, Grace knelt alongside them. Spoken in a low voice, she assured Thorne that he had done everything correctly. "If you knew, how?" His laconic reply was that he had been studying. "We felt it was necessary to know how to deal with such situations after what you taught us about PTSD." Their combined efforts brought the veteran back to the here and now. While Thorne maintained a constant, soothing presence, Grace dealt with the medical elements. After the danger had subsided, the veteran could see them more clearly. Feeling ashamed, he apologized for that. "Decades have passed since I had one of those." "Mr. Thorne, there's no need to apologize," he said with conviction. "We have all 6 of yours." Grace discovered Thorne in the hospital chapel later that afternoon. Seated in the final pew, his leather vest stood out against the serene backdrop. Sitting next to him, she complimented his work from the day. After thinking about Chad's dad, Thorne's voice became scratchy as he replied. "How many other warriors went through what he did all by themselves because we civilians just didn't get it?" A delicate touch from Grace on his arm. "The past is beyond your control, but the future is within your hands." William's arrival cut them off in the middle of their talk. Leader of the Veterans Guard appeared grave. Unpreambled, he stated that he had received word from some contacts. Do you recall the mourners who staged the demonstration? Something major is in the works. Several demonstrations planned for next month's veterans celebrations. Thorne stood up straight. How do we proceed? The reason I'm here, Williams said in response. We're planning to work together on an operation. Protector of veterans. Writers of the American Legion. Viet Cong. A unification is taking place. Need a helping hand. Grace observed Thorne as he thought about this. He would have seized any opportunity for conflict just 1 month ago. He then proceeded to ask perceptive questions regarding protocol, safety, and legal aspects. Williams proceeded to add one more item. Someone needs to coordinate with the police. Ensure that all elements remain contained. Someone who has demonstrated remarkable composure. Williams and Grace both glanced at Thorne in astonishment as he turned to them. Am I following all that we went through earlier? Grace remarked that there were instances. If you want to assist other people change, be the person who has changed the most. Making preparations took up the remainder of the afternoon. They were soon joined by additional veterans and volunteers, transforming the conference room of the hospital into a makeshift command center. Just weeks before, Thorne and his crew would have terrified these individuals, yet Grace saw them operate with ease. Chad came up to Grace while she was on break, clutching a stack of papers. Achieved my first aid certification, he said. Considering enrolling in emergency medical technician courses as a potential next step. A sense of immense pride filled Grace's heart. Houston Community College offers a first-rate program. There is an application that I could assist you with. With the sun setting, Grace returned to the chapel. She had company this time. As they sat in the pews, several members of Iron Hand were deep in meditation. Little did she know, Thorne murmured from behind her. Fear was once considered a sign of strength, we thought. You weren't scared of us when we watched you that day at the cemetery, were you? Grace verbalized her disapproval. Under fire, I have treated wounded, Thorne. Being fearsome isn't a sign of true strength. Being there when kids are scared is important. I'm learning that, he said. We are learning, however slowly. That night, while they were leaving the hospital, the sound of motorbikes revving up no longer posed a danger. What began as a single altercation in a holy site was soon resonating across the entire community as a symphony of optimism, safety, and transformation. Grace showed up at the Veterans Guard clubhouse for the last coordination meeting 2 weeks prior to the scheduled protests. There were a lot of shiny chrome bikes in the parking lot, belonging to different clubs. The sun from Texas made them look even better. There was an air of seriousness and concentration inside. Standing tall and pointing to a wall map, Tank's voice resounded through the room. We need to attend to 5 different places. At every location, there must be a medical crew, security detail, and contact with the local police. Grace looked around the room, noticing that the members of the Iron Hand sat among other veterans, their patches no longer attracting strange looks. Sitting close to the front, Thorne took notes and PR. Obed for specifics regarding methods of controlling the crowd. Tank yelled out to Miss Anderson. Your feedback on the medical response strategies is essential. Grace took her notes and stepped to the front, her blonde hair reflecting the light. I have collaborated with other paramedics and nurses from the VA. We require support teams in addition to our qualified medical staff at each site. Finally feeling comfortable enough to speak up at these gatherings, Chad raised his hand. We could lend a hand with that, my teammates and I, who have all successfully completed the first aid course. In agreement, Williams gave a nod. Grace has been your trainer. The protocols are familiar to you. Grace observed the various groups' interactions as the meeting progressed. Both their actions and the reactions of those around them revealed the Iron Hand members' metamorphosis. Their status in this community was well deserved. Maria came in during a break with diner food and coffee. As she put up the buffet table, she explained that it couldn't be planned on an empty stomach. While waiting for their coffee, Grace found herself seated next to Thorne. Everything about him suggested that he was distressed. "Is there something bothering you?" she inquired. "Rumor has it that a few of our former colleagues may be in attendance," he whispered. "Additional groups who share our perspective. When they see us supporting the veterans, they will be upset." Grace noticed the struggle on his face and examined it. "Do you feel anxious about confronting them?" "No," he said with conviction. "When they disregard all we've learned to value, I'm more concerned about controlling my anger." Williams joined them before Grace could answer. "He mentioned that he had heard about your former companions. Consider it a potential opportunity." Skepticism crossed Thorne's face. "A chance." Grace grasped Williams's argument and realized she needed to show them what we showed you. That an improved method exists. Refocused efforts were put into the planning. We marked the maps, set up the communications protocols, and made the backup plans. Every security detail included Grace's medical staff, with the recently trained Iron Hand members acting as backup. Chad later came up to Grace with an envelope as the meeting was coming to a close. Attempting to rein down his enthusiasm, he announced that he had been accepted. "Next month, the EMT program will begin." Grace felt like a proud sister and embraced him impulsively. "Chad, it is fantastic. The reason behind it is you," he added with seriousness. "Helping others is the true source of strength, as you demonstrated that day in the cemetery." When Sarge arrived, he cut off the speaker. He had insisted on being involved in the planning, even though it was late. "I just got word," he explained. "Protesters have expanded their list of targets to include the cemetery." The room was silent. The members of Grace's Iron Hand were not the only ones who understood the importance of that location. Took his time getting to his feet, Thorne. "We first learnt the meaning of respect there, and that was the beginning of it all." Grace caught his gaze. "The cemetery is something we can take care of. Do you really believe that?" Williams smiled as if he had anticipated this response, yet he still asked. "Sure," Thorne said. Grace also saw how easily he now addressed her with respect. "We need to demonstrate something there." Grace remained for a while, studying the plans and maps, even though the meeting ended soon after. Since that morning at the cemetery, a lot has changed. The same men who had dared to disturb its tranquility were now its devoted protectors. "Penny for your thoughts," Williams remarked, joining her. She said that she was simply considering a change. About how the tiniest epiphanies can spark the most profound shifts in perspective. Willie Williams gave a subtle nod. "Yeah, Grace, you did that. Without dampening their enthusiasm, you demonstrated an alternate path. That's an unusual present." She stated that they had completed the challenging portion. Their decision was to alter. The sound of motorbikes roaring away filled the night as they rode out of the clubhouse. In addition to their Iron Hand emblem, Grace noticed that Thorne and his crew's leather jackets now bore a medical cross with the words, "Veteran's Guardian." She watched as they rode out. Williams murmured something about how proud your father would be. "Regarding both the way you dealt with them that day and the ways in which you have guided them ever since." Grace ran her fingertips over her combat medic pin, recognizing its contour. "Everyone should have an opportunity to improve themselves," he emphasized again and time again. Grace drove home under a starry sky in Texas, her thoughts racing with possibilities. She had faith in the transformation she had witnessed, even though they would face their largest test yet in 2 weeks. No longer did the nighttime roar of motorbikes portend trouble. Security, meaning, and the prospect of ongoing transformation were all conveyed by it. Clear and scorching weather, typical of Texas, greeted protesters on the morning of the demonstrations, threatening to put their patience to the test. With her medical supplies packed and her spirit prepared for what lay ahead, Grace reached the cemetery in plenty of time for sunrise. The members of Iron Hand were already there, with their motorcycles arranged in perfect position at the entrance, as she discovered. They proudly displayed their new Veterans Guardian patches, and each motorcyclist had a miniature American flag on top of their bike. Thorn greeted Miss Anderson with a whisper of self-assurance that had supplanted his former swagger. "It's going to be hot, so we've already checked the perimeter and set up water stations." Noticing their well-planned placement throughout the grounds, Grace nodded in approval. Seen in his saddlebag, Chad's new emergency medical technician textbook was helping him organize the first aid station. "How are your former colleagues doing?" "Shoo," she whispered to Thorn. His mouth clenched as he confirmed their arrival. "Two of our former running groups, the Iron Wolves and the Night Riders, contacted us this morning." The sound of oncoming motorbikes broke Grace's silence as the Veterans Guard and other support organizations rode in. Williams drew up next to them, his expression grave. He said that the first protest group had been seen approaching from this direction. "Your old pals will be joining them in around half an hour." As Thorn checked the radio clip fastened to his belt, he smoothed his vest. "It's all set," Grace observed while everyone assumed their roles. It was a remarkable change. With their expressions fixed intently, the identical guys who had before menaced this hallowed ground now stood sentry over it. Minutes after 9 o'clock, hostilities broke out. With their racist placards and chants, a group of demonstrators made their way to the cemetery's gates. 20 motorcyclists, some with distinctive leather markings that read Iron Wolves, or Night Riders, rode alongside them. An approving voice yelled out in jest. "Watch who's posing as the guard." Former drinking companion of Thorn and current commander of the Iron Wolves, Rex Miller, was the speaker. Even with his shades on, he could be seen smirking. "Hello, Rex," Thorn said in a composed manner. "Across the street, you are welcome to peacefully demonstrate. This very spot is sacred. Here, we maintain a courteous tone." "Polite," Rex spit out. "When did respect become important to the hand of death?" "Hey, what's up with you? Was that attractive nurse able to soften you?" Despite her kind demeanor, Grace advanced confidently. "Rex, they saw the face of true power. Do you have the courage to learn as well?" As Rex and his team assessed the situation, an electric buzz escaped the atmosphere. With the assistance of the Veterans Guard and other affiliated clubs, the members of the Iron Hand remained steadfast. Above everything else, they stood firm. "Rex, you're really outnumbered," William whispered. "Defeated in every way. We will show you how seriously we take the matter of preserving this location if you do not move your demonstration across the street." It appeared for a brief second that Rex may choose for direct confrontation. After then, Chad raised his voice, which resounded clearly in the early morning. "Do you recall, Rex, last month's funeral for Jimmy? The one who lost their life in Afghanistan, your cousin?" Something made Rex tense up. "How does it sound?" According to Chad, he was laid to rest here. Near the oak tree, 3 rows in. Flowers are always on hand when his mom pays him a visit on Sundays. Is it your sincere intention to show disrespect to his grave? Those were poignant words. Similar to the bewilderment she had seen on Thorn's face that morning, Grace noticed Rex's look gradually shift toward uncertainty. With a softer tone, Thorn said, "Allow me to demonstrate something to you." "We have 5 minutes alone, Rex." Rex nodded, which caught everyone off guard. As they approached Jimmy's tomb in the cemetery, Grace observed as Thorn guided him. Caught between their intended disturbance and the sudden change of circumstances, the remaining Iron Wolves and Night Riders moved nervously. Grace made an announcement that our first aid station offers water and cooling towels while we wait. No matter whose side you're on, this Texas sun will not care. It may have been insignificant, but it helped alleviate some of the anxiety. With simple kindness from Chad and the medical staff, a few of the younger riders embraced the water, their defensive postures softening significantly. Both men's eyes were noticeably red when Thorne and Rex came back 15 minutes later. With an emotional rasp in his voice, Rex turned to his colleagues. He told them to get down. This isn't the proper goal, this location. Having lost the backing of the motorcyclists, the demonstrators were dejected. Against the solemnity of the cemetery, their cries rang hollow as their demonstration made its way across the street. Grace and her medical crew treated heat exhaustion and small cuts and bruises throughout the morning. She beheld a handful of the iron wolves remaining, observing the metamorphosis of their formerly companions. Rex approached her while there was relative silence. "I have a question for you, Miss Anderson." "Sure thing." Towards Thorne and the others, he extended a hand signaling this transformation. "Do you believe it?" "Definitely not a one-off." Grace softened her smile. "At some point, Rex, you should visit the VA hospital. Have a look at how they help the veterans. Find out the definition of strength firsthand." Word got around about how the members of Iron Hand dealt with the issue by afternoon. Several Iron Wolves, who were undergoing their own metamorphosis, reportedly showed up at other protest locations to assist with maintaining calm. Grace observed Chad's presentation to a group of prospective volunteers in the main conference room of the VA hospital 1 month subsequent to the demonstrations. As he described the Veterans Transport Program that the Hand of Death had established, his EMT textbook stood tall on the podium. Chad was speaking with an increasing air of self-assurance, stating that it's not simply about providing them with transportation. Keeping their dignity and letting them know they are not forgotten are paramount. Grace observed Rex and other Iron Wolves members taking notes in the audience. The local biker community felt the effects of change as it rippled through. "Are you Miss Anderson?" A voice cut through her train of thought. As she pivoted, she noticed Mike, a younger member of Iron Hand, appearing anxious. "Would you be able to lend us a hand?" Thorne was engaged in a lengthy discussion with Dr. Thompson when Grace accompanied him to the physical therapy part of the hospital. They stood by Jason's side as the young Marine battled his way back from serious leg injuries. "The walker isn't going to work for him," Dr. Thompson explained silently. "Apparently, it weakens him." With Grace by his side, Thorne drew up a chair and placed it by Jason's bed. "What is a true vulnerability, my brother? Do not allow your pride to hinder your progress in building strength." Jason mumbled something under his breath. "No, you are not the one who is extremely weak." "No," Thorne was in agreement, "it was I who, until a particular nurse showed me the meaning of true strength, was too proud to confess I was mistaken and too stubborn to discover an alternative." Seeing Thorne tell their story brought a lump to Grace's throat. What transpired after the incident at the cemetery, the lessons learned, the subsequent metamorphosis. As Jason listened, he began to relax his guard. Thorne completed what he started. "The walker will help you today, and I will show you my bike next week when you are stronger. When you are ready, we can discuss getting you back on 2 wheels." It was heartwarming to watch the optimism radiate from Jason's face. Grace slipped away as he reluctantly decided to give the walker a go, setting them up for their breakthrough moment. She discovered Williams waiting in the corridor. In his direction, the therapy room, he pointed out that you had caused quite a landslide. Grace pointed out that they were the ones who put in the most effort. "They were escorted to the door by me." With a smile, Williams spoke about doors. "Behold the fruits of their labor." Several members of the Iron Hand were installing a new automatic door system at the main entrance of the hospital as he guided her there. For veterans using wheelchairs, the previous one had been a nuisance. According to Williams, they did everything from organizing a benefit ride to soliciting donations from local companies to raise the necessary funds. The local mechanic, Tommy, worked side by side with the bikers, and Grace watched as he expertly installed everything. Compared to the terrifying gang that barged into her graveyard a few months ago, this scenario was light years away. Unexpectedly, Grace was summoned to a meeting later that afternoon. As she and Dr. Thompson sat down to talk, Rex and a few other Iron Wolves leaders considered launching a similar volunteer program at a different VA hospital. "No, we have been keeping tabs," Rex said. Observing the transformation and newfound purpose of the Iron Hand prompted us to consider our own capabilities. As she had cautioned Thorn months before, Grace cautioned that it would not be easy. "It requires dedication." "We're prepared," Rex said, restating Thorn's remarks from that life-altering day. "PTSD and addiction have taken the lives of far too many of our brothers. Perhaps we might start by contributing to the solution." Grace observed Sarge, who was standing at the doorway with a knowing grin on his face, while they went over the facts. Among the many changes that the elderly warrior had witnessed, this one seemed to bring him the most joy. An unscheduled get-together in the courtyard of the hospital concluded the day. The unusual combination of medical personnel, veterans, and motorcyclists enjoyed a dinner that Maria had prepared from her diner. Seated between Thorn and Chad, Grace observed their crew's deft handling of medical personnel and patients. Members of the Iron Hand were planning future volunteer efforts while Chad addressed an interested audience about his emergency medical technician education. "A recurring thought in my mind is that first morning at the graveyard," Thorn whispered. "We were completely mistaken about everything." According to Grace, not everything. "One point you made was correct. According to you, I was an angel." She grinned. "Certainly not the type you had in mind." Then, a police motorcycle escort showed up, cutting off the subsequent laughs. Upon hearing that an injured veteran was being transferred from a local military hospital, the members of the Iron Hand wasted no time getting to work clearing the way and assisting with the transfer. Grace observed their labor as they worked, their actions becoming more deliberate and focused. The medical workers were no longer agitated by the sound of approaching motorbikes. When aid had arrived, it usually signaled the opposite. Grace reflected on their progress as the sun dipped below the horizon in Houston, painting lengthy shadows over the hospital grounds. Even though the Iron Hand insignia was remained on their vests, it now represented change instead of fear. Motorcyclists were revving up their engines in the parking lot, preparing to leave to pick up veterans who needed rides home that night. Instead of signaling aggression, the roar of motors now signified a pledge of assistance. Grace proudly sat in the front row of the Houston Community College auditorium 6 months after that initial incident in the graveyard, seeing Chad's EMT certification ceremony. Members of the Iron Hand weren't the only ones who came to celebrate. Veterans, hospital employees, and even a few Iron Wolves all joined in the raucous. "From threatening a nurse to being a member of the medical team, it's something I never thought I'd see the day," Williams murmured as he sat next to her. They met at Maria's diner, an unexpected gathering spot for their family, after the ceremony. The walls now bore pictures of the motorcyclists' voluntary work alongside medical professionals and veterans from a variety of events. "Miss Anderson, I have something to tell you," Thorn began as he stood up once everyone had calmed down. A choice was reached by the clubs. Unveiling a leather vest with a unique cut caught Grace's eye. The Iron Hand patch remained, but it has been reimagined as a medical cross encircled by protective hands. He made it official, "We're rebranding. The Guardian Angels MC is our new moniker going forward." The hand symbol is still there, but the focus has shifted from harming to assisting. Everyone in the room agreed with the announcement. Grace saw Rex nod carefully, as if he were thinking about making the same adjustments to his own club. "Not only that," Chad added, flashing his shiny new EMT badge. "A formal program to transport and support veterans has been in the works, and we've been collaborating with the VA on it. Our model has piqued the curiosity of other clubs around the state." As they laid out their strategies, Grace paid attention. Since that morning in the cemetery, the change she had seen had progressed farther than she had anticipated. These guys hadn't suddenly turned a new leaf. Their transformation into leaders was a model for others to follow. The party was cut short due to a critical call. A veteran was isolating himself at home during a severe attack of post-traumatic stress disorder. The atmosphere went from celebratory to businesslike in a matter of minutes. Williams clarified that he, too, is a motorcyclist as they hurried to their respective cars. They may be more receptive to our requests. As Grace accompanied Chad in the ambulance they had rented, she observed his methodical equipment checks. She no longer felt threatened by the unsure enforcer. Taking his position was an assured doctor. When they got there, they discovered tension. Marcus, a veteran and ex-Marine, had locked himself in his garage. He was drawn to the window by the sound of approaching motorbikes. As he took off his helmet, Thorne yelled out to Marcus. "We are the angels of protection. Here are some people that can relate to your situation." Their professionalism and empathy in handling the situation was something Grace hadn't anticipated seeing from them 6 months ago, but she watched as they did just that. As they learned more about PTSD and Chad's medical background, they were able to win Marcus's trust. "Are you guys truly seasoned, Guardians?" As he started to collect himself, Marcus asked with an air of suspicion. To be honest, Thorne did not always say that. "I used to contribute to the issue." Real strength was then imparted to us by this nurse. A hand motion toward Grace modified every aspect. Grace was coordinating with the VA's mental health response team when she overheard Thorne telling their story while Chad was checking Marcus's vitals. For whatever reason, Marcus related to the change from troublemakers to guardians. "After I get well, maybe I can pitch in," Marcus whispered. Grace returned to the diner later that night and found herself absorbed in the wall art. Pictures of the guardian angels, formerly known as Iron Hand, serving as pallbearers at funerals for veterans, security detail members for memorial services, and VA hospital volunteers. Part of their narrative of metamorphosis was conveyed in each image. "The finest part, you ask?" Thorne joined her and spoke. "Helping another person brings us a tiny amount of healing for ourselves." Feeling her father's battle medic pin, Grace beamed with pride. Healing occurs in that way. As word gets out, it affects everyone. There was a lot of chatter and laughter in the restaurant. Veterans, motorcyclists, and medical personnel all exchanging anecdotes and future intentions. Stronger ties of purpose and mutual understanding had replaced the formerly impenetrable obstacles. A procession of motorbikes shimmered beneath the Texas night sky. Its chrome was polished to a mirror finish. However, they were no longer used as symbols of fear. They stood as symbols of hope, with their riders at the ready to respond to any emergency. With a tender touch on Grace's shoulder, William introduced himself as Grace's father. All of this would make him proud. In terms of both you and the extraordinary thing you've helped build. Grace surveyed her strange family. Rex is organizing volunteer programs with his Iron Wolves, Chad is talking medical protocols with other EMTs, and Thorne is teaching newer members season support tactics. Their metamorphosis was far from over. More and more people were being affected by it daily. She whispered that sometimes the strongest person isn't the one who stands up to another. Rather, it's about demonstrating to them an improved posture. As the 1-year mark of that tragic morning in the cemetery drew near, Grace became more introspective. A pioneer in veteran biker partnership initiatives around the state, the VA hospital had also experienced a metamorphosis. As she made her way to work one morning, she noticed something out of the ordinary in the parking lot. A squad of Iron Wolves were being instructed by former members of Iron Hand and Guardian Angels MC on how to properly fasten wheelchairs into their brand new transport trucks. "Keep in mind," Chad was stating, his EMT badge glinting in the dawnlight, "that our comrades in arms deserve nothing less than the best treatment when they are being transported." A voice shouted out to Miss Anderson. As Grace pivoted, she beheld the young Marine Jason, who had before declined to utilize his cane, now walking steadily with it. Tommy and the Guardian Angels had his motorcycle adjusted so that it could fit his rehabilitation, and it sparkled behind him. Glancing over at you, Grace grinned, recalling the irate youth who had rejected assistance few months prior. "Am I prepared to go on my first group ride?" Without a doubt, ma'am, Jason nodded in agreement. I've been learning from Thorn. The message suggests that I may soon be able to lend a hand with the veteran transportation program. Grace discovered Thorn engaged in a profound conversation with Dr. Thompson within the hospital. A new program was being reviewed, a motorbike therapy program for veterans suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder and depression. As Thorn was elaborating, the independence of the route. It can be a potent medicine when accompanied by sympathetic riders. Regarding medical matters, Dr. Thompson responded, the peer support program on your crew has produced outstanding outcomes. When veterans see your guardian angel's patch, they often feel more comfortable opening up to you. Standing at the doorway, Grace recalled how these very men had once relied solely on intimidation. They were now establishing themselves as legitimate therapists. They were able to use their life experiences as tools for recovery. Throughout the day, there was a constant flow of accomplishments and minor triumphs. After finishing their volunteer training, Rex and the Iron Wolves were prepared to launch their own program at a different VA center. 2 additional club members were being guided by Chad as they pursued EMT certification. The change they saw had piqued the curiosity of even some of the night riders. Grace was in the chapel once again during her lunch break, but this time she had an unanticipated guest. Maria, the proprietor of the eatery, sat silently by her side. You know, Maria whispered, people were terrified when those bikers first began frequenting my diner. She grinned now. Even when it's not for food, they're still among my most loyal clients. They have begun a food delivery program for homebound veterans, helped replace my roof, and even attended my daughter's wedding. Grace gave a knowing nod. The metamorphosis had altered more than simply the motorcyclists. Everyone in the town now saw what was conceivable in a whole new light. Something extraordinary happened in the afternoon. Frank, a veteran of World War II and one of the Guardian Angel's frequent transfer passengers, was the recipient of a surprise. Many of his former military friends were unable to travel, and he had expressed his need for their company. They had collaborated with the VA's IT staff to arrange a virtual get-together using a video conference system on their tablets. A lot of people got emotional seeing Frank's face light up when he reconnected with old acquaintances. Thorn whispered to Grace, "This is it." Both of them were watching intently. Even the smallest things can add up to a significant impact. As the day drew to a close, Grace found herself back at the graveyard from whence it had all started. The area around the venue was spotless. Keeping the place immaculate was the Guardian Angel's mission. Numerous graves were decked with fresh flowers, and little flags danced in the evening wind. Similar to her initial morning at her father's grave, she stood there this time with company. The strange family that had grown out of that altercation gathered around her. Community people, medical personnel, veterans, and bikers, all working together for a common goal. While delicately caressing the icy marble, she murmured, "You were right, Dad. Understanding and compassion, rather than fists, can win the hardest confrontations." With his leather vest transformed into a shield from danger, Thorn materialized next to her. "Mr. Anderson," he whispered. "Something unique to celebrate the occasion has been on our minds. Tell me what you were planning." He described it as a memorial ride. No ordinary ride, though. "We want to tour VA hospitals around the state, tell our experience, and maybe inspire other clubs to do the same." Grace beheld the man standing at her side. He was still powerful and tough, but now he was using those traits to help others rather than hurt them. Others could now find hope in the metamorphosis she had seen. "What about your dad?" Thorn persisted. "You are unlike any hero I've ever encountered, Miss Anderson. You demonstrated that making a conscious decision to change may be really courageous at times." The roar of motorbikes resounded as nightfall approached. At this moment, though, it was a message of hope, safety, purpose, and change. Carrying the story of how the bravery of one nurse had transformed not only their lives, but the lives of an entire community, the guardian angels rode away, their patches glinting in the final light of day. They couldn't have predicted how much the memorial ride would develop. Grace and the guardian angels were at the forefront of a movement that expanded from a single state to another, all because of a simple notion. More than 300 motorcycles, including members of competing clubs, converged on the parking lot of the VA hospital on a brisk morning. Keep in mind that Grace spoke to the assembled multitude, her voice resonating amidst the sea of chrome and leather. Nobody cares about us here. What other communities can achieve and we decide to be better than them is the point. As she stood there, Thorn could be seen, his guardian angel's patch reflecting the dawn light. The former intimidator had undergone a complete metamorphosis, emerging as a revered authority in veteran care programs. He told the gathered motorcyclists that at each stop they tell their tale, display the programs they've created, and maybe even encourage other clubs to follow in Miss Anderson's footsteps. With his newfound certification as an EMT, Chad had coordinated medical support teams along the whole course. Others were inspired by his commitment to healing. There were now 5 additional club members who were enrolled in EMT programs. "Have you seen anything interesting, Miss Anderson?" With a signal, Rex summoned her to the gathering of the Iron Wolves. To find fresh patches, they unzipped their leather vests. Embroidered beneath their wolf emblem are veterans who have been allies. Things are starting to shift. Williams watched as the two people interacted. "You created something powerful, Grace, from Iron Touch to Guardian Angels, and now the Iron Wolves finding their path." Their initial stopovers were at various smaller Texas hospitals and VA clinics. With a sense of pride, Grace observed at each stop as her unexpected family recounted their tale of redemption. Now that he had softened his tone, Thorn talked with authoritative grace on the transformative force of change. Other groups of motorcyclists, including young veterans who were also having trouble adjusting to life after serving, were greeted at a modest VA clinic in East Texas. They felt a profound connection to the Guardian Angel's narrative. With his combat boots caked with dirt from their most recent tour, a teenage rider inquired, "You mean what? You turned out to be the one who could fix everything." Chad, whose EMT credential was shining in the sun, said it was better. "Our lives were given meaning. Being fearsome isn't the mark of a true strongman. Being present for them in their times of need is crucial." It had an instant effect. The young veterans were so moved by what they saw at the clinic that they were already talking about starting their own support group when they left. Grace overheard Thorn conversing with the boss of a local motorcycle gang when they were having lunch at a diner in a small town. As he was explaining, "It's not about compromising your identity. Becoming your true self is the central theme." The days melted into one another as we traveled long distances, making pit stops at hospitals and gatherings with veteran organizations and motorcycling clubs. Their narrative touched the hearts of everyone around them in every place they went. The metamorphosis they had undergone was serving as a model for others to follow. Grace felt a twinge of déjà vu from a year ago when she, too, had to deal with unpleasant community members at a VA hospital. They met a nurse who was just like her. She was shown how the Guardian Angels had transformed hostility into alliance during their extended stay there. Grace informed her coworker that the secret is to look under the surface and see the potential that lies there. There was a better way for these men, they weren't terrible. Their caravan had expanded by the week's conclusion. Along the way, more clubs joined them, each contributing a chapter to the tale of transformation. Every town was taking a page out of the Guardian Angels playbook when it came to helping veterans. Many people were moved to tears when Chad revealed news during a nighttime stop. He was proud that the state medical board had acknowledged the EMT program he had helped create, which catered to ex-riders. His voice was heavy with emotion as he spoke about everything from saving lives to delivering fists. "This is all because that morning in the graveyard, there was one nurse who refused to give up on us." Grace observed the continual expansion of her seemingly improbable family. An altercation that started in a holy site had escalated into a movement that affected people all across the world, not just in their little Texas town. Grace sat quietly that night and listened to the talks going on around her as they gathered around campfires at a ranch owned by veterans. From veterans finding new purpose to medical professionals meeting unexpected allies, experiences of change are shared by bikers from different clubs. "Mystifies me, you know what?" Thorne joined her by the fire and said. "We used to believe that being strong meant instilling terror in others. The key, we've learned, is to earn their trust." Their leather jackets had patches that signaled protection rather than aggression, and the flickering shadows of the fire danced across the faces of the assembled enemies who had once been mortal enemies but were now bound together in purpose. Instead of warning of impending danger, the distant roar of motorbikes signaled the arrival of aid. In their last week of the memorial ride, they arrived in Washington, D.C., where national veterans organizations had taken notice of the change they had inspired. Grace gracefully stood before the assembled officials, exuding an air of quiet power that matched her attractiveness. She calmly recounted that it all started with a confrontation. But it turned out to be about change, about proving that better choices are always an option. At this point in time, their presence was comforting rather than frightening, as the angels of protection lined the rear of the meeting room. As the president of a highly recognized veteran assistance organization in Texas, Thorne took great pride in his transformation from a terrifying cemetery intruder. In his remarks to the panel, he expanded on the program's scope beyond transportation and security. "This is a story about veterans finding their way, and it's also about motorcyclists who have found their way." Hundreds of veterans were securely carried to medical appointments, dozens of PTSD episodes were successfully intervened with, and their model was adopted by several clubs across multiple states. These are just a few of the figures that were presented. However, the anecdotes had the most profound effect. Proudly wearing his guardian angel insignia and EMT qualifications, Chad took a step forward. "I was the type of patient that nurses were afraid of a year ago," he confessed. "Now they know who to call when they need assistance." That is the appearance of true change. A number of seasoned support group representatives swarmed Grace during a break, all interested in hearing Grace's program details. The questions sought to delve into more than simply the practical aspects, they sought to comprehend the integral role of the people involved. In Grace's view, the most important thing is to know that behind every seemingly insurmountable barrier is the capacity for profound personal growth. It was more important to teach these men a different way to be powerful than to break them. Just outside the building, they were met with a surprise. There had assembled a band of seasoned motorcyclists from all over the nation, and many of them were sporting patches resembling the angel's wings. Unexpectedly, their metamorphosis had far-reaching consequences. "There it is. Grace," William whispered. "What you did was spark a movement, not only influence a handful of troublemakers." Another landmark was achieved in the afternoon. Taking a page out of the Guardian Angels playbook, the VA has launched a nationwide campaign to collaborate with repentant motorcycle organizations. The appointment of Thorne to the advisory board effectively erased any memory of his troubled history. His voice was strained with emotion when he addressed Miss Anderson. "Recall how you stated we were clueless about true strength that morning in the cemetery?" The daughter of a war medic, Grace touched her father's pin and nodded. "According to him, you were correct. You didn't merely inform us, though. What you demonstrated was clear to us. Ever since then, you have demonstrated it to us." The day came to a surprising close with a recognition. For her nursing service and her part in developing a new paradigm of veteran support, Grace was honored with a special recognition award from the Veterans Administration. According to the speaker, sometimes the most selfless deeds don't include following predetermined routes but rather daring to forge entirely new ones. At a subsequent dinner honoring their accomplishments, Grace saw as longtime competitors sat side by side, reminiscing and plotting joint ventures. The Iron Wolves were engaging in conversation with interested clubs from several states about their own metamorphosis. Chad was helping out aspiring emergency medical technicians from different motorcycling organizations. Can you believe it? Maria, who had traveled especially for the event, watched. These men believed a year ago that respect was derived from dread. Its origin in service is now known to them. As night fell, thoughts began to swirl. Grace was greeted by an unexpected family as she stood on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. Under the moonlight, the marble shimmered as motorcyclists and veterans came to pay their respects. Grace whispered into the night, her voice barely audible, that her father had taught her that one's journey, rather than its beginning, is the true measure of their character. Thorne showed comprehension by nodding. He went on to say that believing in yourself isn't always possible, sometimes you need someone else to believe in you. They listened as the roar of motorbikes drew near. This time it was a tribute, not a threat. Hundreds of motorcycles showed there, their riders eager to see the metamorphosis firsthand. Standing tall, the guardian angel's patches reflected the memorial's lights, proving that change was within reach. At the end of the night, a vow was made. Every club that was there made a solemn promise to spread the word. Serving others could be where that strength is found. It was feasible to find redemption. That making a different, better decision was always an option. As Grace observed, her family of changed spirits mixed with new friends, telling tales and offering each other hope. The stunning nurse who had earlier confronted irate motorcyclists had become a national inspiration, demonstrating that even the most powerful people can be helped by those with the most tender touch. Returning to Houston seemed different this time. From their vantage point in the medical support vehicle, Grace and Chad could see a lengthy procession of motorbikes. Now it's not only guardian angels, it's club reps from all throughout the nation, and they're all returning to their own communities with the power to inspire change. According to Chad, who expertly navigated the Texas roadway, it's hard to believe it's just been a year. A representation of his progress, his EMT credential gleamed in the early light. Even now, when I wake up, I wonder if it was all a dream. Grace said it was the finest form of change. Discovering your true identity is like waking up to a familiar face. They started their journey at the VA hospital, the very place where it had started. Numerous well-known faces flooded the parking area. Workers who had witnessed the guardian angel's metamorphosis from enemies to friends have spoken. Dr. Thompson was so proud that he stood at the entryway. As the motorcycles pulled into the driveway, he signaled a warm welcome. Despite the fact that I've heard you've been quite active in evangelizing. The story of their success was told by the scene inside the hospital. The veterans who had been timid about motorcyclists before now welcomed them with open arms. While assisting another injured soldier in the physical therapy wing with his gait, Jason found solace in sharing his own story. "Have you seen anything interesting, Miss Anderson?" She was escorted by Thorne to the main meeting room of the hospital. Photographs and press clippings chronicling their ordeal, from the initial confrontation in the cemetery to their recent acknowledgement in Washington, adorned the walls. Grace was particularly interested in the most recent edition, though. Pins placed on a huge U.S. map indicated which other clubs had taken their lead. They had ignited a metamorphosis that was rapidly spreading. According to Williams, who joined them, each pin signifies a club that established its own initiative to serve veterans. It seems like many individuals were really hoping for a better approach to be shown to them. Another landmark was achieved in the afternoon. Motivated by Chad's achievements, the nearby community college introduced a unique scholarship program tailored to rehabilitated motorcyclists pursuing careers in medicine. An aspiring paramedic and young Iron Wolves member was the first beneficiary. As Rex watched the announcement, he noticed that it was like a chain reaction. 3 more clubs in nearby states were motivated by his club's makeover. We end up assisting others through each person we help. At the cemetery, where it all started, they gathered one final time as the sun started to set. As evidence of the guardian angel's hard work, the grounds were spotless. At each gravesite, fresh flowers were placed, and little flags danced in the twilight wind. At her father's grave, Grace knelt and delicately touched the chilly marble. "You were right, Dad," she muttered. "Using kindness instead of force can win you the biggest battles." In a reverent quiet, the assembled riders, including members of the Iron Wolves, Guardian Angels, and hundreds of other clubs, surrounded her. As the night fell, the multitude of candles they held illuminated the area like a sea of light. A year prior, Thorn spoke to the assembled multitude, his voice resonating throughout the hallowed site. We viewed this area as undeveloped land that could be claimed. We now know it is something much more valuable. It serves as a constant reminder of our reason for serving. They recounted their personal journeys of growth one by one. The transition from enforcer to healer was Chad's topic of discussion. After seeing the Guardian Angels, Rex said, his own club decided to take a different route. Rather than resorting to intimidation, new members discussed discovering purpose via service. But none of it, Thorn said, turning to Grace, would have been different if it hadn't been for a single nurse who recognized potential in us despite our rough exteriors and taught us that true power comes from inspiring trust rather than dread. The sincerity in his voice moved Grace to her feet. It was you who did the tough work, she said. You decided to be different. You had the power to transform into someone greater than yourself. The cemetery was lit up by hundreds of candles as night fell entirely. Despite their history of animosity and territorial disputes, the assembled riders were now standing together in purpose. The distant roar of motorbikes signaled the arrival of rescuers rather than impending danger. The finest part, you ask? Standing by Grace's side, Chad whispered a word. This is only the first step. We are all a part of something greater than ourselves with each new club that joins, with each veteran we assist, and with every life we touch. Feeling the shape beneath her fingertips, Grace touched her father's combat medic pin. As she reflected on their path to this point, she recalled the initial confrontation, the subsequent rise to national recognition, the subsequent decline to respect, and the subsequent rise from anarchy to purpose. In the stillness of the night, she would occasionally speak. Facing an opponent head-on isn't where your strength lies. In demonstrating to them how to stand stronger as a unit. The assembled motorcyclists understood the veracity of her statement and nodded in agreement. In the soft light of the candles, a myriad of artifacts, including patches, angels of protection, iron wolves, allies of the veterans, and many more, spoke of personal growth and change. Unified in purpose, Grace saw her strange family as the stars rose over Texas, bikers, veterans, nurses, and warriors. The stunning VA nurse who had earlier confronted irate motorcyclists had become an agent of change, demonstrating that the kindest touch can elevate even the most powerful souls. They realized that their narrative was far from over in the solemn stillness of the graveyard, the same place where it had started. Its wingspan was during its most recent stage of development.
Disclaimer. This channel stands against all forms of intolerance, discrimination, racism, and violations of human rights. The stories shared here are original creations, developed to encourage reflection, understanding, and constructive dialogue. All content is produced with a commitment to respecting diversity and honoring human dignity.